Very first of our series of Dirt and Democracy. So glad you're here with us. Welcome all the people in the room and online. And I just wanted to talk about the series in general to introduce you all a bit to what our thoughts are behind it and get you excited for not only this session, but future sessions. The goals of this series are really to build community and lay the educational foundation for preserving democracy and using it in our own organizing. And we have topics planned, including consensus, which is next week, and then conflict transformation in social movements and examples of success and failure in different organizing spaces globally, from India to Kenya to Virginia, and the use of community spaces like the Grange. So lots of cool stuff in the future, and we look forward to seeing all your faces then too. And this is also where we're better educated as a community in resisting corporate land grabs and commodification of land and ecosystem services here in Vermont. The principles will be broadly applicable, but we want to mobilize them in our discussions for our community right here. So we also have on the ground efforts to build a community base of support for farmers, helping farmers farm essentially, and putting this educational foundation into practice. And that extension of our work is called Farm Force. So also get in touch with us if you're like looking for a labor brigade to come out to your farm, and you want to have more of these conversations on your farm as we're weeding or whatever. We can see in the room we have reps from Cedar Circle, where we had our first labor brigade at. Bringing it back to tonight, though, in particular, we'll be learning about how farmers' alliances work, organizing versus activism, and orient ourselves to our power and the powers we are up against. And we'll be doing this with some framing from Jen Byrne at White River Natural Resource Conservation District, Henry Harris of the Center for Grassroots Organizing, and we're so excited to be joined by James Mumm, an organizer who's been working in urban and national context over the last 35 years at places like People's Action and 22nd Century Initiative, but I'll introduce him more properly and in length later. But I want to turn it over to Jen for a little bit of framing at the beginning about conservation districts.
Thank you so much, Ayana. I'm here in Thetford at one of our viewing parties, and I'm going to do a so brief intro to the conservation districts. If any of you know me, you probably know this spiel already, because it's basically my whole personality now. But we're going to go with it. I'm going to show you just like maybe 3 slides to help me go through a little bit of the history of why we're hosting this through our conservation district, and what are some of the, oh, here, I can't even pull it up, some of our organizing efforts. And for some reason, it's not really working to pull up my screen, unfortunately. Let me see here. I can just do this. And here we go. So very briefly, conservation districts are national infrastructure for locally led decision-making in natural resources. We exist across all 57 US states and territories. There's over 3,000 districts. Pretty much wherever you live in the United States, you live within a conservation district. And districts were created really out of the Dust Bowl. As early as 1935, USDA recognized that they needed ways to extend conservation to more landowners, more farmers. And they believed the solution was to establish democratically organized soil conservation districts to lead the conservation planning effort at the local level. They recognized that their demonstration projects were often seen as too expensive, or just another, government program being forced upon farmers without their input. They believed that they really needed farmers to be involved in the development of conservation and conservation projects. And so in 1936, the USDA drafted a sample state law This is very unique. I don't know of any other examples of this happening. There very well may be, but the authors of the law felt like the districts needed to be created and run by the people living within the boundaries of the watershed. They also believe that all federal programs should be run through this new government entity, and that the SCS, which is now the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, the federal government, should only function through the newly formed conservation districts rather than on its own. And they felt that these programs should allow local farmers to control decision-making about how policies are written. And here we have the establishment of the conservation districts. So I think the only other slide I'm going to show you here is this one, which is a strategy framework for just transition that was developed by the movement generation. And I posit to you that conservation districts fill this role really nicely, and that we actually can change the rules from the local level going up, informed by people on the ground, informed by practitioners, informed by farmers, to shift economic control to communities, democratize wealth in the workplace, advance ecological restoration, drive racial justice and social equity, relocalize production and consumption, and retain and restore cultures and traditions. So I think that's all I'll say for now, but we do exist. Get involved. Run for your local board of supervisors, and get involved with your conservation districts.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. And Henry, do you want to chat with us for a little bit about Farmers Alliances?
Sure. We're so excited to be here for the kickoff of the Dirt Democracy series, helping y'all transition from a dirty democracy to a different sort of dirt-based democracy, one step at a time. So we got James Mumm to come and do the lion's share of the blabbing today, and we're all in for a treat. I knew James as a badass organizer in New York a bunch of years ago. And then he moved in next to me in Brooklyn, where I lived at the Brooklyn Free School. And I think he handed me my first copy of The Populist Moment in an elevator in his apartment building. And he knew it was going to take me for a ride, and it did. It really changed my my wannabe revolutionary thinking at the time. So I wanted to just give y'all a little bit of the context of what the farmers' alliances were that gave rise to the populist movement. Basically, what I read in this book, which was said pretty clearly, was that over the course of 3 or so years, the Farmers Alliances turned out 40,000 lecturers. You know, we're talking about the late 1800s, 40,000 organizers that they called lecturers, helping people create farmers co-ops, and taking on the national financial system and trying to create a fiat currency to help bail farmers out of debt. They were and they ended up taking on JP Morgan, you know, one of the arch robber barons, and the crop lien system that was in place at the time. So basically the background is after the Civil War, the agricultural system that replaced the slavery-based agricultural system in the Deep South, which was primarily cotton, but all kinds of crops, was redistributed as more of like a different kind of labor indenture. It's been compared to slavery a lot. It's not similar to the chattel slavery of African Americans, but it is very similar to many forms of historical global slavery, in that, you know, if you guys remember Little House on the Prairie, the TV show, Pa would come down and he'd turn in all his goods, and then he'd get a bolt of fabric and a pot and some sugar. Well, you could go down there and you could turn in all your crops for the year for about half of what you needed, and the rest of it you'd get it on credit, right? And then if you couldn't pay the balance of the credit and the interest for next year, well, then your debt would grow, and your debt would grow year after year after year, because you could only put in enough crops to get about half of what you needed back out. And so what the Farmers Alliances at the time did was that refused to sell your cotton in North Texas. And everybody's going to get together. They're going to say, we have this many tons of cotton and we're not going to sell it. And by that cotton not appearing on the market, it raised its market value. It raised its market price. And then they could sell it on the market and be able to get more money for their product and at least pay off their debt, their interest, and not go deeper into debt. And that caught on like wildfire. The populists, the farmers alliances had figured out a bread and butter issue to actually help bail people's butts out of peonage and serfdom, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, in the course of just a few years, they mobilized wagon trains from Oregon to DC of upwards of 2 million farmers, took on the fiat currency idea, which basically after the Civil War, there was the currency was deflationary basically because the federal government was paying off their war bonds. And so all these farmers that were just using newspapers and snail mail to communicate about what was going on helped to break the cycle of gold backing the US dollar. And while some of them were into silver backing because it was more plentiful, they did break out of the cycle of precious metal backed currency so that the result was that farmers' money was worth more and they were able to pay out their debt. The whole point in saying any of this stuff is that a few farmers in the late 1800s with very little means of any kind at their disposal worked together, created co-ops, created massive confederal alliances ultimately, and really made economic and social change for a lot of farmers all over the country. I'm not going to get really into what happened as they try to transition into the populist party, but I would put it to you like this. Basically, they believed the hype of a functioning democratic system. And when they tried to run presidential candidates and really tried to make waves in federal legislature, they were met with the National Guard and rigged elections and a bunch of problems. And they didn't get a president. They did get a bunch of elected officials, but the book on that is called The Populist Moment by Goldwyn. It's good, it's short, it's fun. And there's your little intro to the populist movement, to the farmers alliances. And I think you're going to see how some of what James is covering today are tools that we can use to try to do similar kinds of organizing in our agrarian movement. So thanks so much.
Yay. Thank you. Okay, so I'll just say a little bit more about James and then I'll hand it over to him. So James Mumm is a veteran organizer, fundraiser, and communicator who began his career with an internship with the National Training and Information Center in the summer of 1989. For the past 35 years, James has worked with local organizations in Chicago and the Bronx, including People's Action Institute affiliates, ONE Northside, and the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, and on the national staff of People's Action/Institute, Greenpeace USA, and the 22nd Century Initiative. James is the co-author of People's Action Institute's landmark white paper, The Antidote to Authoritarianism, How an Organizing Revival Can Build a Multiracial, Pluralistic Democracy and an Inclusive Economy. And this is from 2023. And over 30 book reviews and articles. Of particular interest to the Dirt and Democracy series are 2 reviews, You Say You Want a Revolution, including a review of the populist movement, and Hiding in Plain Sight, which includes review of Dirt Road Revival and Harvest the Vote. And we can sign up for all of these for free on Substack. All content is free always. And we will include links to these things when we send out the recording and reminders and registration for next session. So no worries scrambling to find all the things that I just listed off. And last but not least, James is the incoming Chief Institutional Advancement Officer for People's Action Institute starting on June 17th this year. So welcome, James, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ayana, and thank you, Jen and Henry and everyone else for being here. I'm really delighted to join you all tonight. This is a special interest of mine. I'm an urban person, but I get to work closely with rural folks in a bunch of states and small town folks. And so I hope that's helpful to you, and I expect to learn a lot tonight too. So I'm a big believer in local organizing, and I have a presentation to share with you, but all organizing is local, even if it's, big national campaigns. In the Bronx, it was building by building or school by school. And in rural and small towns, it's the same way. Here, I live in New Rochelle, New York, which is a town of about 80,000 people here on the Long Island Sound. And I have a paid job. I do organizing, but I'm an irrepressible organizer, which most organizers are, and that includes all of you. So I work on school and library board elections. And so conservation districts get me so excited because these like school and library boards, these are small town, small elections that you can win. And so I know for school boards, there are about 14,000 plus in America. And so ours is composed of people that believe in racial equity and school for all kids, and our libraries believe in free speech because we put the time in to elect those folks. Um, I also work a lot on environmental issues here in New Rochelle. We're on the Long Island Sound. We passed a climate emergency a couple of years ago. This week, our city council is poised to pass a resolution asking our city manager to look for every opportunity to apply for direct pay, which is one of the federal infrastructure programs that came out of the pandemic and post-pandemic period, where you get lots of money for doing clean energy programs in a place. So we're looking forward to that. And I'm particularly proud, my son was part of a negotiating team. So as an organizer, I helped a group of high school students and elementary school students 2 years ago negotiate with our superintendent. They wanted to end single-use plastics, and they had 3 planning meetings. They prepared a deck. They met with the then superintendent. He said yes, and he said, I'll do you one better. We formed a green schools committee that now is doing all kinds of amazing stuff in our school district, and students, teachers, parents, community members, school staff are all kind of working together to figure out how to green and transform our schools. So I say all that to say that organizing really works, and the more local it is, the better. So I'm going to share my screen and walk through share a bit about organizing and its connection to rural and small town organizing, and some of it to the populist movement and the Farmers Alliance of 100 and some years ago. But then we'll get into some activities together and some conversation about what you're working on and how some of the tools and concepts in community organizing might help you advance your agenda where you are. Does that sound good? Okay, all right, great. So I'm gonna share my screen, which I think I can do. Let's check this out. Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna adjust this. Okay, whoops, now I'm all the way at the end here. Whoops, let's get all the way back to the beginning. So this is a preview in reverse. Okay, there we go. So there you go. So now you saw it in reverse, and I can see it forward. And folks may pop in here. My family is just back from being out, and I mostly made dinner, so they have to do it the rest of the way. But they may have a question or two about what the heck we had planned. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about organizing, strategy, and power analysis for your Dirt and Democracy series, which sounds just truly awesome. So I want to share a couple highlights. Henry mentioned some of these, so we won't spend a whole lot of time on them. The book that he mentioned, The Populist Moment by Lawrence Goodwin, is not a very long book. And at the end of the presentation, I'll have a link to both a book review of it. And for all the books I review, I take notes. And so I can share you those essentially Cliff's notes, for those of you that remember those printed things. And you can read them. So it's a way to read the book in 20 pages, or you can read it in 300 pages. Okay. So these are from the book. So this is from Lawrence's study. He passed a few years ago, but he spent a lot of time looking at the movements that arose in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And he said a few things. He said mass protest movements do not happen because of hard times. That was what his academic research said, because for most of recorded history, times have been hard for the vast majority of people, and harder for women or gender nonconforming people, harder for people who are people of color, especially in white supremacist societies. So there's lots of ways that times have been hard for majority people, but that doesn't mean people rise up. Now, let me say there's always resistance to oppression. Anytime there's oppression, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's organizing and resistance. But that doesn't mean it's mass protest and strategy. So there's lots of examples in history where resistance has led to those things. But just because times are hard doesn't mean that people are going to, organize millions of their neighbors and coworkers and fellow congregants. That takes a few other things. So in the book, in the populist movement, Goodwin talked about four different things, four different stages of democratic movement building. You'll recognize them in your conservation district or the other local organizing you're doing. So the first is like our own organization. That's what this means, the creation of an autonomous institution where new interpretations of reality can materialize that run counter to those of the prevailing authority. So that means, let's take simplicity here, the movement forming, but that means forming organizations that set their own agenda. That when someone says that's not possible, they say, oh, why not? Like, why can't we have, harm-free, why can't we have people stay on their farms? Why can't we have all the things that we want in terms of locally controlled economies? So that's what organizations do. When people's organizations form, you get to set your own agenda. The second one is, well, and then you need a bunch of people. So the creation of a ways to attract masses of people. And Henry lifted this up, in the 1870s and 1880s, no, we did not have all the things we had today. We had the postal service, we had the printing press, and we had talking to people. And so those are the three main technologies that folks use to organize a like 3 to 4% of the American population into the alliances. So that was, imagine today, right? So that we have all the tools of today, like that would mean organizing tens of millions into formal alliance with each other, working toward economic cooperation and bottom-up democracy. So if they could do it then, they didn't even have a fax machine. I think we've actually forgotten how to use fax machines now, 30 years later. So, but technology has very little to do with the power of organizing. And so that's the point there. We have to bring in people. Then it's, you have to get what he called culturally unsanctioned level of social analysis, meaning contrary to white supremacy or contrary to at the economic supremacy, especially of the Eastern banks and the merchants that offered credit. So you have to do something different. You have to want a different reality and believe it's possible. He called it the movement educating, but that's what we're doing right now. Like this is the kind of stuff that is number three. And number four is like what's the institution? Now you've got them. You got a bunch of people and you have a bunch of ideas. Well, what do? Well, you get an agenda. And that's what the movement politicized is. Anyway, so these are the four different ways that he talked about how about what happened back then. But he said there were three preconditions for democratic movement building. So I found these to be really transformational in my own experience, and you might too, which is people in organizations need, we all need individual self-respect. We have to believe in ourselves, and we have to believe that we can be agents of change. And we have to help others believe that too. And there's a lot of barriers put in our way. So the further you are from a white, cisgendered Christian male in America, the more people have told you that you don't deserve self-respect. And so everyone has to do a lot of work to either unlearn or relearn or reclaim individual self-respect. But that comes with what we're doing tonight, which is getting together and organizing and telling each other that it's possible. The second one is really fun. This is the part of organizing that you've probably done many times and may know and love: collective self-confidence. It's a block club gets a new stop sign, or we win massive regulation of banks. It's big things that we do together and we feel really good about the results. So they can be on any scale. But those two aren't even enough. Then you have to have an agenda, right? And that was really the key for the populist movement and the Farmers Alliance. They got people organized. They got folks to believe that they could achieve things together. Then they developed both an economic and political agenda. So I know that's true for you all in your conservation district and the other organizations you're a part of. Having a really sharp agenda for how you want our democracy to function and how you want the economy to function is critical. So this is the last time I think about this stuff, and some of this is covered earlier. So I just pulled these off the internet. They weren't exactly this way in the book, but can you imagine like the farmers? Now there was two alliances, right? we had segregated America. So that's these were their names back then. We would not do this now at all. But the white farmers alliances, especially in the South, did not allow people of color, African American farmers, to join. So there was a parallel and but equally large alliance of farmers. You imagine these farmers growing very rapidly over a couple of years into each claiming more than 1.2 million formal members at that time. And then like the 40,000 lecturers, these are folks who were organized by county alliances and sub-alliances. So that's how people organized. It was like a county, and then each county had subsections, right? So like a city and its neighborhoods. And 2,000 newspapers. So this is how people set their own agenda, created their own news, and started to do that analysis and shaping together. So we'll get into a little bit about what, how, and why we do that today. So that's a little bit more about the farmers' alliances and about the populist moment. You can read lots more about that in that book and others. Well, let's get into some talking about organizing. So what they were doing then and what we're doing today are not so different. Except, so I do a lot of work these days with groups around the country, orienting organizing toward contesting for governing power, meaning that the people-powered organizations and in alliances with each other can win governing power. We can win, we can elect people to our school boards. If the conservation boards are elected bodies, you could do that. City councils, counties, water authorities, lots of different things to elect folks to. But that is the goal of a good section of the organizing movement today, is to win governing power. Why? Because then you get to set the rules. Like whoever has the levers of power gets to set the rules. And that doesn't make you authoritarian. But during the financial crisis, I worked a lot on reining in the banks and eventually winning the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Accountability and Consumer Protection Act of 2010, especially the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But a lot of folks involved were homeowners and tenants who, for whom government is not necessarily good, right? Government has not treated a lot of people well in this country because of who's had control of it. So we talk about how government is the prize, not the problem, meaning like it's a thing that we have contests over. And now here we are in a time of rising authoritarianism. So there was a lot of authoritarianism back then. There's always been authoritarianism since folks came to settle this country where other people lived many hundreds of years ago. And so that has always been true. It's a feature, not a bug of American democracy. However, now we're in a period of rising authoritarianism, not just in the US, but all around the world. So we have a special responsibility to address any forms of authoritarianism we find at whatever level we're organizing. So this comes from that white paper, and there's a link to it. But I'd like to talk about how organizing supercharges democracy. And we have so many crises facing us, like climate crises of isolation, economic crises, so many. And authoritarianism seems overwhelming, but they should not be disarming. And the antidotes to authoritarianism are everywhere, because it's everywhere people are. So it's any community, congregations, places where people work, schools. Those are the places where folks can get organized. So there's both the bad news and the good news, which is things are rough, but we can organize anywhere at any time, and that's been proven over and over again by many communities across the United States. So, and I know this gets at the truth of what Henry and Jen were sharing, which is the farmers' alliances and the folks that were the people they were fighting back then. They were fighting literally J.P. Morgan Chase himself. Now we fight, J.P. Morgan Chase, the bank, right? It's like the same entity over 2 centuries, and other forms of corporate power. So at People's Action, and certainly the other groups that I work with, we'd like to get to the root causes, and all of our organizing is both aimed at relieving material suffering. Like, how do we help people right now suffer less who are most impacted? And of course, people doing it themselves. But what are the root causes we're trying to get to in 5 years, in 10 years, or 20 years, or 50 years, or 100 years? And so structural oppression, so that includes, structural racism baked into our society, but also structural sexism, structural gender oppression, by ability, et cetera. So lots of ways that folks in the United States face oppression, but it's structural. It's not just individuals against each other. And I think you all know that. But it's also corporate power and concentrated wealth. So those two buckets are root causes, both back then with the farmers' alliances and now today. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about what organizing can do, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the theories, like a theory of change that I subscribe to. I'd love to share with you all, get some thoughts on, and then we'll dig into some exercises around power analysis if that works. So the great thing about organizing is that it really moves people. And I mean, you've all done this, but I mean, I knew it in my own experiences. It has transformed my life. It has made me a different person because of the people that I've met one-on-one with. I mean, literally thousands now, or in small groups with, in church basements, in people's apartments, in people's, living rooms. Like, we change each other by organizing. And there's a practice called deep canvassing you may be aware of. There's a People's Action and another group have formed a thing called the Deep Canvas Institute. This is a particularly transformational entryway for organizing because it goes out and talks to people, go out and talk to people who are not with us already, and listens without arguing with them, and doesn't set like litmus tests for whether or not they have to pass the first conversation. But a lot of what's happening in America now is that people are getting their meaning made, like why are things not great? Like why is the economy not going the way people want it to? Why is it not going well in their life? And so if they just listen to Fox News and all the InfoWars and the other mess, like they're going to get like, who's to blame? Immigrants or people of color or somehow trans kids, like causing their problems. That's absolutely untrue. So, but if that's all the news they get, well, then that's it. So that's why we have to organize. We knock on doors and talk to people we don't know already, or show up in places and we talk to folks and help them make new meaning. And it doesn't happen just once. It can happen over a period of time. You all may know this story. So this has been done, this has been formalized now. It's a practice that's hundreds of years old. But in 2012, you all may be aware that there were two big propositions on the ballot in Minnesota. One of them was to require photo IDs in elections, which was designed to eliminate people from voting. And another one was to define marriage between a man and a woman. It was the 30th state to take up a state constitutional change or legislation. And of course, the marriage equality movement had been growing in savvy and power and strategy, but had lost 29 times in states. And so they had to try something different. And so this is where the modern deep canvassing began. So they knocked on doors, and you can still watch the YouTube videos where they recorded some of the conversations, knocked on doors and said, hey, I'm here to talk about love today and relationships. And they just began. So this is done with volunteers because you can't pay, you sit on a door for 30 minutes at a time with folks and you talk through like, well, what does it mean to love somebody? What does it mean to really care about somebody? Like, tell me about someone in your life you really care about. And what happened in those conversations that people started to surface after 10, 20 minutes, they'd be like, yeah, Aunt Ethel never married. I think she may have liked women. I love Aunt Ethel. Oh, okay. You love Aunt Ethel. You think she has the right to marry someone if she wanted to? Like, oh yeah, she should have that right, And then it goes from there to, well, do you think anyone could have that right? Like, should have the freedom? And then it moves people. Anyway, so that's what organizing does. It sort of takes us all, like all of us, to another place. The other thing it does is build majorities. And this is what we need to both win elections, but also to make sure that we're like representing the will of the people, and especially multiracial, cross-generation formations. That's how so it's not, our goal is not to be minority power, but to be majority, like the vast majority. In fact, super majorities of people believe in expanding freedoms the freedom of our bodies, the freedom of borders, etc. Like we're the side that believes in freedom, despite what the other side's rhetoric is. And then lastly, it builds power. And so we'll talk a bit about that, but all the elements all the tools in the toolbox are about building power. And so we'll spend a little bit of time on this, but there's some notes here. We'll get into power analysis today. We won't spend a ton of time on action and reaction. We will talk about strategy, which is a lot like chess, not checkers. So when we're in campaigns, sometimes it feels like we take a move, the other side takes a move, but we should have a well mapped out, beginning, middle game, end game, etc. Anyway, so this is what organizing does. You all are engaged in this, and of course, it's a thing we can all do a ton more. Okay. So I want to spend a minute on this. And so, I don't know how much conversation, and maybe we could pause after this to take some questions. So Ayanna, if there are some questions in chat so far, which I can't quite see by doing this, but if there's questions about organizing or about power, we could stop and talk about those for a couple minutes, because that'll help us move to the next phase. So in organizing, I like to talk about organizing is made up of three things, three currencies, three ways we can get more power. Organized people, that's the easiest one for us. That's our most accessible resource because they're all around us. Organized money, when we put our money together to form organizations or do collective projects or economic cooperation, that's a form of organized money. But so is Goldman Sachs. That's another way to look at organized money, right? And organized ideas. So how do we advance, like what's considered way off base? You can't even talk about that here versus, oh, yeah, that's in the conversation now. Sure, we can have marriage equality, or sure, we should have compassion for immigrants or whatnot. So how do you get ideas to enter the public debate and be considered legitimate ideas to discuss? Well, lots of folks have to be talking about them, and that's how we organize ideas. So power comes from those three places, and that's true of us. It's true of the authoritarian movement, like from white supremacist and male supremacist groups, but also to the banks and to other folks that were still fighting 150 years after the Farmers Alliance was. Let me stop there and just see if there's any questions people had or wanted me to clarify or have an opinion they'd like to share about organizing and power, and then we're going to jump a little bit more into strategy.
Feel free to unmute yourself and raise your question, or you can put it in the chat and I can lump similar questions and ask James, but.
I thought I can keep rolling, but as an organizer, I rarely just keep talking. We are taught to listen more than talk, so it's always a challenge for me to actually present something.
You're doing great.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to continue, but Ayanna, feel free to hit the pause button and ask me to stop so that we can take some questions or clarify anything at any point.
Sounds great.
Great. Okay. So I'll continue. All right. So now we talk a little bit about strategy. And I'm going to share some thoughts about strategy that come from hard-won organizing, and I'll share a few stories as we go along here too. So this is my favorite thing in the world. So anyway, this was designed by the designer at People's Action, Billy Kirkton. She's amazing. But the ideas here come from many groups all across the country, with particular help from a group called the Grassroots Power Project that helps organizations of people, large and small, think through how to make really big change over time. So I'm going to walk through this a little bit with everybody here. So what this is on the one scale, it's about power. So the more power we have, that's the vertical scale. And then horizontally, it's like, how much structural change can we make? And by structural change, that's different than I would call stepping stones. So stepping stones is when we win one small thing that then helps us win the next bigger one. And for me, structural means when we transfer power. And so we have lots of stories I'm sure we can share about when the other side, so like by other side, I mean the corporate conservative movement or the authoritarian movement has won structural reforms. And so when they win them, it moves power from the public to private corporations, or from people to corporations and the wealthy. And so what we do when we make reforms, like what we're aiming for is like each campaign step is designed to get us closer to taking some, like I know a bunch of groups across the country have over the past couple of years deprivatized Medicaid. So Medicaid was privatized in their states, both the management of Medicaid and the delivery, and they unprivatized it and brought it back into the public sphere as a public good, right? But we can see it on when the right is sort of lump them all together. When they win, school choice, when it allows charter schools or students to use vouchers at religious or private schools. What that does, that's a structural reform when they pass laws like that at state level or at the national level, or even locally in school districts, because that moves money and power to private interests and away from the public. Okay, so that's what these things at the bottom are. It's like we start with stepping stones, we go to smaller structural reforms, then we win some game-changing ones. Like if anyone has any examples, you can pop them into chat. Like what are some structural reforms on our side that you have been really proud of or you've seen in your lifetime? Anything come to mind that we've won that's been particularly transformative? Because that's where we're going with this, is like we win bigger and bigger things. The more power we have, that's the exponential line. So if we have lots more power, we can win lots more transformation. But usually at the beginning of a fight, especially when the other side has been at work for decades on changing the landscape, meaning gerrymandering and cutting people off the voter rolls, deciding who's in and who's out of the economy. Like, 100 years ago during the New Deal, we got some great, great stuff. But farm workers were excluded from the benefits of many of those. So were African Americans. So were most immigrants. So were day laborers. So were domestic workers, right? So lots of folks were excluded from participation in the economy. So a lot of our work at the beginning is we have to make landscape change. So we have to change like the terrain that we're organizing on. So that's where lots of folks have mixed together issue campaigns with 501c3 vehicles or volunteer vehicles, and electoral shifts through volunteer groups, 501c4s, PACs, and things like that. But sometimes, as a good friend of mine, Ron Jordan from the Bronx said, if you can't change the people, change the people. And so that's where that comes from. And so we also have to shift the dominant narrative. So if people say, oh, we can't do that here, we can't pass marriage equality, or we can't have great public schools that serve all the kids, well, then we have to change the story. So that's what shifting the dominant narrative means. And sometimes there's big movement moments. So what I'm talking about here is a bunch of like, what some folks call structure-based organizing groups. Sometimes there are mass movements that arise either in parallel or outside of that kind of a situation. They're sparked. So look at on our most recent history, we had Occupy, essentially rose out of that, or Me Too, or Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. Now, there's lots of organizations in those spaces, but the popular eruption of protest, was unprecedented, right? What the Women's March was able to do. And then we had the largest protest movement in American history within our lifetimes, just 4 years ago in the summer. So anyway, so we need a lot of those to make landscape change. So this is a theory of change called the long-term agenda theory of change. And what it means is, like, as a group, you don't think just about what you want to win this year and next. There's an exercise, and I'll show you it, that groups are doing to go like, to sort of plan backward. So what kind in Vermont, and other places where you're like, what do you want the, farming or conservation agenda to be in the state of Vermont? Like what's your ideal? And I'll tell you a story. Like I've done this with folks all over the country, and I was on the Lower East Side of Manhattan with a place called Good Old Lower East Side, a 501c3 organization. And, we did this exercise. We talked about how especially the corporate conservative right took over the past 60 years. They deliberately did it. It was based on structural racism, right? A reaction to the freedom movements from African Americans, from Latinos, from women, from the LGBTQ community. Many more freedom movements came out of coalesced in the 1960s, the student movement. And there was a huge reaction to that. And as you all may know, Lewis Powell, who then became a Supreme Court justice, wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that said, y'all have to take power as seriously as you take profits. And that 1971 memo was a wake-up call to the U.S. Chamber, which then became the biggest lobbying organization in America. And they and a whole host of other people that, bad actors, went on to do just that. They changed the terrain to favor corporate power and minority power. Anyway, but we can do it too. So then we were on the Lower East Side, and the way we do this exercise is you to find out what you really want. You say, well, what are you working on now? And so there's tenants, and a couple staff members, but 25 tenants in a room. They're like, well, I guess I would like a rent. I don't want the rents to go up anymore in New York. So if you live in a rent-regulated apartment building, every year they decide if the rents are going to go up or not, how much they're going to go up under rent regulation. So the tenants were like, we want a rent freeze this year. I was like, wow, that's great. Let's put that up on the board. Rent freeze. Okay, great. So you won. Amazing. What do you want to win next? And they're like, so here we are in the next year, we're on the chart, and they're like, how about a rent rollback? It's like, that sounds good. Let's do some rent rollbacks. As we put rent rollbacks up on a sticky, someone put it up on the board. I was like, year 3, like, what do you want? They're like, why am I paying rent? So the people are very radical about their thoughts. Like, we pay all the expenses for this building. We pay and a profit. All the heating, all the maintenance, everything is paid for by the tenants. Why don't we own it? And so I think we find that everywhere. I mean, I've seen it everywhere I go, among workers, among folks in Iowa, to the Lower East Side. And it's like, after 1 or 2 or 3 years of thinking about victory, it gets to a pretty radical place where the people start and the public starts having a much bigger role in the economy or how our democracy works. So that's this long-term agenda theory of change. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I just said, which is how we got here. This is a very abbreviated history of that. But the movement by corporate and conservative and authoritarian forces since the 1960s, like as a reaction to the country growing slowly and painfully more equal, was to try to flip the script on that. So they began to build a massive corporate infrastructure to consolidate all that political power and economic power. And of course, they use crises to make rapid progress. That's a key element of the corporate strategy. So we saw it in the bank bailouts and the reaction to unfortunately, the government was captured by Wall Street interests when the crisis happened in 2007, 8, 9, right? The financial crisis you all remember. Their first thought was like, what can we do for the banks? What can we do to help the banks, right? So the Federal Reserve of New York and the Federal Reserve nationally convened banks to go, how can we help you, right? So they never let a good crisis go to waste. And so Bank of America got bigger, right? Chase got bigger. Citibank got bigger. Wells Fargo got bigger, right? And throughout the crisis and made money. So they use crises to make rapid progress. We can too. They use racism, which we do not, to strategically divide us, right? So we see this, it's very sharp in our country today about how race is used and other forms of oppression are used to divide us and conquer. But they run all of their campaigns in a divide and conquer. Like, we do not. Like, we run campaigns to build majorities, but it is worth thinking about how some of our campaigns peel off folks on their side and divide and disrupt their power more strategically. Other things that they do, they engage in the battle of big ideas. We do too, but they're trying to limit the debate to only their thoughts. We are trying to expand the debate to include the majority's thoughts. And then they do those structural reforms that transfer wealth and power. So this is the corporate power long-term agenda. So when they plot this out, they map out their stuff over the decades this way. Now, very closely related, I would say, but slightly different, is the authoritarian long-term agenda. This is the MAGA agenda, right? So they want to engage in the battle of big ideas too, but they do it to shift blame for economic equality onto immigrants, people of color, women, and LGBTQIA plus people and others. But that's who they want to blame for why they're not doing so well in today's economy. Not that maybe corporations have moved their jobs and cut their wages and privatized things. The authoritarians want to capture, defund, and dismantle democratic institutions that protect pluralism, such as public schools, colleges, universities, and public media. You all read about, Florida's a prime example where the governor DeSantis, just like starts changing schools, like changing how the public university system was governed. But you all probably have great examples that you've seen of this kind of stuff too. We've seen a lot of this undermining free and fair elections until elected autocracies fully control electoral outcomes. Like we're in, for the first time in American history, like we've had lots of elected autocracies in America because women were not given the franchise for a long time. African Americans were given it, taken away. And so, so we've had elected autocracies all across the United States. We still have them in many counties and cities, et cetera. But this fall is like, this could be the first federal elected autocracy in America where someone gets elected, maybe, and if Trump is elected in a free and fair election, he may not relinquish control, right? So this is the first time that has occurred in the US. And then the last part of their strategies to enshrine the democratic rights of heterosexual white Christian males and criminalize or limit the democratic rights for others. So these are what we're up against. So we're up against a corporate agenda, and we're up against an authoritarian agenda. And they're like friends for a while. Eventually they will deviate and fight amongst themselves, but their interests are aligned at the moment. And ours is different. So this is what like I hear from people around the country and sort of representing it here, which is we can use crises too. But we can use it to advance democratic control of government by people, not corporations, the wealthy. So the next time there's like a tornado or a flood or a hurricane, well, why not, we saw it in Katrina. What happened after that was school privatization, right? The taking away of public goods and turning them into private hands. So we have to have our agenda. When there are crises, we have to advance our agenda. Then we can look at advancing structural reforms in the economy that move, power and wealth from corporations and the wealthy to us, the people in the public, in service of a fair, caring, sustainable economy where all workers are entitled to dignity and respect, and all communities achieve climate resilience and environmental justice. That's what we would do if we ran the circus. Then we would also engage in the battle of big ideas, but we would be using it to name the actual problems, like the actual root causes and the actual people causing the problems, and not try to trick people. And we would talk about our values. We value democracy, interdependence, freedom, etc. And lastly, we would build democratic infrastructure to bring people in. Like we believe in inclusive democracies, where everyone has the right to vote and everyone has the right to a voice in the economy too. Anyway, so we have a strategy, they have strategies, and they're all long-term. So I'll go through these. I'll share links to these afterward. This is just a way you could do this exercise yourself, like in your own organization, your own town. It's in an app called Mural. I have a link at the end. It's free to use. I'll show you what it looks like next, but it takes this sort of theory and lets you put your own stickies up there. Like, how do you want to change the landscape? What things do you want to win? And so it lets you do that. So it's an exercise you can do for that. This is what it looks like in an organization's office. This was at the Greenpeace office outside of DC. But you can sort of see what we had people do was like name the reforms they wanted, name the power we needed to build in yellow. So reforms were in red, power was in yellow, and name the landscape changes that had to happen in blue. What's so powerful about this exercise, then you ask people to put them in order, talk about how they're interdependent, and then what you find is where the barriers and what are the things holding us back? So you actually find a lot of stuff stacked up in like years 1 and 2. Like we can't make progress on a thing we want to win until we build more power. We can't build more power until we change voting rights. And, so there's our interdependencies. But this really helps folks develop strategy. But it's a real thing and you can do it. And so this is what it looks like when groups are doing it. This is actually good old Lower East Side. I think most of the pictures here is like we just put, it's just butcher paper. And we put stuff up on it, and we ask folks to talk about how the 1% rig the economy, how we can unrig it and make change. And then we ask them to share their own thoughts about it. What it led for them to was like, they've done big organizing. Since then, one of their staff members decided to run for office. She's now the city council person for that part of New York City. And so, you don't like the people, change the people.
And fill out these different things.
Yep.
And I think most people on here will be okay with spending a few more minutes, maybe wrapping up some final ideas, and
Right.
then yeah.
Great. So yeah, so what I'm leaving you with is and you can, and this deck is yours. You can do it with shit. It says people's action. I do work there. This isn't, I just used the deck that Billy designed, but I'm sure they're fine with their name. The logo, I couldn't figure out how to take the logo off it. So this is like how to do a power analysis how to. That's on this page. The next page, and this includes like I'll show you what the links are. Is more about the power. So there's like instructions on power analysis. There are links earlier on that long-term strategy and how to do that in Mural, which is a really fun tool with virtual sticky notes. You can also do them on butcher paper on the wall. A-okay. Same thing here on power analysis. And then lastly, I'll leave you with some links here, which a variety of things. So the top, and you can just click on these once you have the PowerPoint in your own, the Google slide deck in your own hands, which is the Cliff's Notes of the Populist Moment. If you want to just skim through it. This book review includes that book and a couple of others. This book review includes Dirt Road Revival about Maine, about electoral politics in Maine with Chloe Maxman and Kenyon Woodward. Terrific book about rural organizing and electorally. And it's a really good book. As you may know, they started a project now. And Harvest the Vote by Jane Klebb, who's a transplanted Floridian in Nebraska. She fell in love, stayed in Nebraska, is now the chair of the Democratic Party and is a pipeline fighter. And has a lot of lessons from the pipeline fights in that book. There's a paper I wrote about organizing and under authoritarianism, some more articles related to those that are just have various and sundry tools that might advance your organizing locally. So that's it. That's what we have here. And I'm going to stop sharing, turn it back over to Ayana and Jen and Henry and friends, and see what's next.
Amazing. Thank you so much, James. That was wonderful. So our next session is going to be on the 23rd, same time frame, and it'll be consensus training. So look out in your inbox. We'll send out an email with the slide deck, registration link, the recording from this session. Yeah, and thank you all for tuning in today. I don't know if Jen or Henry want to say anything to wrap up, or
Thank you so much. Thank you, James.
yes.
We'll definitely be reaching out to everyone and promoting our next event every other Sunday, 5:30, Dirt and Democracy.
Dirt Democracy. Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks for having me. It's been it was really a lot of fun. Look forward to talking again.
Yeah, can't wait.